Good morning. Welcome to Village in Motion. Today is Thursday, May 31st, 2018. We are well into summer, and this morning we are here with a book talk. And I'm welcoming Patty Pearson. Patty is the author of Fly Girls, the daring American woman pilots who helped win World War II. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you here. Patty, quickly give us a synopsis, just in a couple of sentences, about our book.
Well, it is the story of the 1,102 women Air Force service pilots of World War II.
And the women Air Force service pilots were known as the what?
WASP.
As the WASPs. And there were 1,102 of them.
Yes, and so they flew military planes for the Army Air Corps during World War II, but they were not part of the military. They were civilians. And they did a wide variety of flying within the United States.
They did not fly in combat?
They did not, no.
And why did you decide to write a book about them?
Well, my background is in history, and I taught high school history for a very long time, and then wrote history curriculum and materials for another very long time. And then these women, the WASP, were in the news in 2015, the spring of 2015, because one of them, a local woman, Elaine Harmon, who lived in Silver Spring, Maryland, died at the age of 95 with a request that she be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And the commandant at Arlington National Cemetery said no. And so they were in the Washington Post, they were on the local news, and I had never heard of them. And I was appalled that I had never heard of them, having taught history for all those years. I'd never seen them in a textbook, college, or the ones I taught out of. I'd never seen them in the great huge tome sitting on my shelf at home about World War II. They were not mentioned.
So here you were teaching history, and this was a part of American history you knew nothing about.
Nothing.
And you decided it was time to do something about that.
I did. So I started poking around to see how much of a story there was there, and decided there was a pretty good story there. And I write for young readers, ages 10 and up, and I thought that this would be a good story. It gears to girls in the sense that these were women flying military planes before anybody knew they were flying military planes, but for kids in general, about patriotism. So you really went into this
knowing nothing except what both you and I saw on the news in 2015.
Exactly.
And I was the same as you. It was like, what? Who were these women?
Yeah.
Why didn't we know about them?
Why didn't we know?
So tell us what you learned about them. How did they get started?
Well, what happened was that as World War II was approaching, it had started in Europe, but the United States was not involved, 1939 and 40 and most of 41. And this country started building its military as rapidly as possible. We had a very small military before that. And one of the things they needed was pilots and planes. And so they were training men to be pilots as rapidly as possible. But there were two women who knew that there were an awful lot of very competent women pilots already out there. And one of them, Nancy Love, herself was a pilot. She was a member of the 99s, which still exists today. Amelia Earhart had been the first
So we all knew of
president.
Amelia Earhart, but she wasn't the only woman pilot.
Not at all. And so Nancy Love came up with this idea, wrote to the military. They ignored her. But she continued to do research to find where these women were that she knew were extraordinary pilots, and she made a big list of them. At the same time, another extraordinary pilot, Jacqueline Cochran, who still holds more records and titles than any other pilot, male or female,
so as I read
was
the
doing
book,
the same thing.
This wasn't women pilots who took a couple of lessons and said, oh, I'm going to solo, and look, I'm a pilot. These women had many, many hours of flight time.
Nancy Love recruited only women who had at least 500 hours of flight time.
It takes a lot of flying.
That's
to
a
have
lot
that
of
many
flying.
Hours.
And Jacqueline Cochran recruited some of those women, and in fact had a program. She went to England, where the British were already doing this, and she had 25 American women come and work with the British before the U.S. was involved in the war. And then in the fall of 1942, the military finally decided that they really did need more pilots. Initially, they said, we don't need more pilots, we need more planes. But in 1942 and into 1943, the Allies were losing the war. And the result of that was they were losing planes and their crews rapidly, a terrible loss. And they did need more pilots, and they needed them to be people they could train quickly. And all of these women already had pilot's licenses. They weren't starting from scratch, so
and
they could
the
train
men that
quickly.
we had as pilots, we were using, and we were sending them overseas also.
Yes. Yes. And of course, there were men here, both military and civilian, who were doing the same jobs these women were doing. And the idea was that if we hired women to do it, every woman who was doing this freed up a man who could go overseas and fly in combat. And so that was the goal, to free up those men. Not all of the men doing this job could fly in combat. Either they were too old, or perhaps a medical reason or something like that. So they weren't going to just eliminate them, but a lot of them could be combat pilots and wanted to be combat pilots. But somebody had to be flying the planes in the US. So they were doing jobs like flying the planes from the factory to the bases where they were needed. And from there, then the military pilots would fly them overseas to where they were going to be used in combat. They flew them, that's what the women in Delaware under Nancy Love did exclusively, was ferrying, it was called.
So these women they started out with how many women?
28 in Delaware. And then 20,000 applied to BWASP.
Not all of those women had the requisite number of flying hours.
They took them in smaller groups. The Jacqueline Cochran group were training in Texas, Houston initially, and then Sweetwater at Avenger Field. They did not need that 500 hours. They started with fewer hours, and as time went on, they even lowered that requirement, but they still had to have the license, and more hours than any men had to have. Men were coming in without licenses or any hours.
So they would only take women who had flying licenses.
They had to have the license.
Who knew that many women knew how to fly at that time?
Exactly. It is interesting, but flying was, after World War I, a lot of those aces were flying the little tiny biplanes and things, and they became barnstormers. They did shows, they did air shows. And some of these women, they saw these air shows and they were just as interested as the men.
They got the bug too.
They got the bug. And a lot of them had pilot's licenses, some because they were well off and could afford an expensive hobby, and others because there was one woman who lived on a ranch and that's how they got around, a huge, thousands of acre kind of place.
So these women were stationed at various places in the United States, and they ferried planes from factories.
From factory to base, from
bases.
one base to another. They tested planes after they'd been repaired to see if they'd been repaired properly.
Reading about that was one of the scariest jobs.
It was. It was the most dangerous job outside of combat, was to be the test pilot on planes that had just been repaired.
Because sometimes
they hadn't.
They had been repaired, but not necessarily as well as they should have been.
And there was a problem in the planes in two ways. One is that the spare parts and new tires were going to Europe for the planes that were flying in combat. If that plane was going to be used here in training or what have you, it got the leftovers, if it got anything. And so they were really held together, just held together. They had planes that were redlined, meaning they weren't supposed to fly at all, and they were still flying them because they didn't have any options. So there were a lot of instances of tires blowing upon landing because they were just threadbare. Engines quitting in midair, that kind of thing was not at all unusual. And so the women and men who were flying in those capacities on training, they did target towing. So
I think that had to be the scariest one. Tell us what target towing is.
Well, you took a plane up, similar to if you've been to the beach and you see the little planes going across the beach saying, "Eat at Joe's Crab House," or whatever. Same idea. You took a plane up, and attached to it was a banner. And the men who were training to be anti-aircraft gunners were practicing shooting at that banner. What they discovered was they couldn't use blanks. They don't fire the same way that an actual bullet fires. And so they were using live ammunition. And some of the men were just starting this training, and maybe it wasn't their strong suit. Some of them misunderstood their instructions, and these people would land the planes with holes, bullet holes
they weren't hitting
in
the
plane. They were hitting the plane.
They were hitting the plane.
Several planes were actually shot down. No one was killed, but they did shoot the planes half the time. And so that was a job that these women did.
These are
was
women
target
with nerves
towing.
of steel, I think.
They did have nerves of steel. They really did. Amazing. They also eventually flew the great big planes, not initially. But over time, the head of the Army Air Corps at the time, Hap Arnold, believed women could do this job. He opposed the program initially because he didn't think they were needed. Then he authorizes it because they are needed. But he doesn't think, he himself was a tremendous pilot, he didn't believe that women could fly the great big planes because they had no power steering, shall we say. These
Right.
are bare bones planes. The inside is just like the outside. It's just metal and rivets. There is no padding, no insulation, no pressurization. It's just as fast as you could build a fuselage and then the engines.
And did the women have to train specially to do this?
They did. You couldn't just get in there. Now, they flew 78 different kinds of military planes in the course of things. The military
I read
men,
stories of some of them kind of flying with one hand and looking at the manual
yes,
with the other.
they would keep the instruction manual on their laps
Yes.
while they were flying so that while you were cruising, you could reread the how to land it part.
Yeah.
Because it was so unfamiliar. And most of the military men, as a pilot, you train on a plane and that's the one you're going to fly. That's the kind of plane you're going to fly. But the people who worked in all these other jobs, ferrying in particular, men or women, flew 78 different kinds of planes. And you never knew from one day to the next what kind of plane you were
Kind
going
of like
to fly.
working at a car dealership. Here,
Exactly,
take this car.
exactly. And so when it came to the great big planes, though, they did require special training. And so the first two women, Nancy Love was one, and Betty Gillies, another, a tremendous pilot, flew the B-17, and they were the first women to train on one of the bombers. Arnold had thought that women just simply wouldn't have the physical strength to do it. He didn't doubt their skill, but those things were just difficult to fly.
I remember reading one story of them doing quite a bit of physical training.
They did.
to
They
have
did a
the
lot of
strength.
physical training. All of them did, but particularly when they were getting ready to fly the great big things. And they had to make adaptations. Now, Betty Gillies was not quite 5'2" and weighed 110 pounds. The seats in those planes were bolted to the floor. They didn't move back and
Wasn't an
forth. They didn't
hydraulic
go up.
adjustment.
They didn't go forward. The controls didn't move. And so you just had to be able to do it. And I had the great privilege of going about a year and a half ago to the Manassas Regional Airport, and there was an air show there with a B-17. And because I was writing the book, they gave me a special tour of it, and I got to sit in the cockpit, which the people paying for the tours didn't get to do. And I'm about the same size as Betty Gillies, and I could not see over the control panel to see outside the plane.
Yeah, I think she sat on some boards or some
I
books.
couldn't see
or-
out the side windows. I couldn't reach the rudder pedals.
She used some blocks on the rudder pedals, am I
She
correct?
had wood blocks made that would slide over the rudder pedal and give her an extra 3 or 4 inches to reach those pedals. She sat, and many of the women would carry, you can see pictures of them where they're wearing a parachute, and they've got 2 more parachutes on their backs. And you think, why would you have 3 parachutes? It's really, you only get 1 chance with a parachute. But they sat on them.
They were sitting on them.
Because they were thick, and they would sit on them, maybe put one under them, one behind them, that kind of thing, so they could reach the equipment in these planes.
Now, was the B-17 the bomber that was used to drop the atomic bomb?
No, that's the B-29.
The B-29.
The Super Fortress. And that one, again, a lot of these planes were developed very quickly. They did not get the testing that planes today would have because they were needed so badly. They were remarkable planes, but they did have glitches because of that lack of testing. And the story on the B-29 that was out there, the rumor was that it caught on fire pretty easily, which it did. Paul Tibbets, the man who flew the Enola Gay to Hiroshima, liked the plane. What they needed was a plane that could get from the island of Saipan in the Pacific, was as close as they had gotten to Japan. You needed a plane that could get to Japan and back without refueling. And the B-29 was it. And so he trusted the plane, but he understood its idiosyncrasies. A lot of men training to be pilots did not want to fly it for obvious reasons. And so he had 2 women at a nearby base. He asked for volunteers of who would train on it, and several volunteered. He trained them for about 2 or 3 days to transition from what they were already doing to that plane. And then he did a little air show to demonstrate the B-29. And when they landed and got out of the plane, and all the men are watching,
Look
and
who
it's 2
came
women
out.
who have come out of the plane, they decided, well, maybe we could do it. Maybe it'd be okay. So the women ended up doing that quite a bit with the B-17, the B-29, the B-26, because they all had individual
And I think you
issues.
said in the book that after a while they pulled the women off that because there came up to a point where it was embarrassing the men.
It was embarrassing the men,
Well,
and
oh
so
my,
they
we
got,
wouldn't want that to happen.
Paul Tibbets was fine with that. He needed pilots, but he got word from Washington to stop doing that.
Let's talk about how these women were treated. How was life for them? And they had all the excitement of flying. That was their main goal. They loved
They did
to
it.
fly.
They loved it.
That's why they joined.
loved it, and they were willing to put up with the discomforts of military life, even though they weren't in
How
the
did they
military.
live?
They, interestingly, the men doing the same jobs, who were civilians, the civilian men doing these same jobs, did not have to act military, but the women did. So they had to march. Well, they didn't have anybody to train
Did they have
them.
uniforms?
They did not initially have uniforms. And in Houston, no one sold women's pants. So they had to buy men's pants and try to make them fit. When they got their flight suits, they were leftovers. They came only in men's sizes, and apparently large men's sizes. And so they had to figure out how to roll up the sleeves multiple times, roll up the pant legs, hitch them up at the waist so they weren't tripping over everything. The only advantage was you could put a lot of layers underneath for the cold. Eventually, they did get uniforms, but they had to pay for them themselves, which men in the military did not. The officers got a $250 uniform allowance. The women did not.
And
they had paid
their
for
housing
themselves.
sometimes was not
They
provided?
initially there was no housing for them in Houston because there just wasn't any, and so they were living in boarding houses and things in town and having to make their way out to the airfield every day. When they moved to Sweetwater, then they did have barracks. They were living in barracks as if they were in the military, marching, doing all those kinds of military things, but they weren't being paid as much as the military men or the civilian men doing the same jobs. They weren't having their uniforms supplied free of cost. They had to pay for their own food. When they went elsewhere, ferrying a plane, oftentimes they couldn't stay on the base where they dropped off the plane, and they would have to go into town and
Yes.
pay for a hotel or a room somewhere and pay for their own food. They were occasionally thrown out of restaurants because they were wearing pants, and women did not wear pants.
And as in the Hidden Figures story,
Yes.
they often had to walk great distances to use a restroom.
That's right. That's right. When they first started training in Houston, there were men finishing up training at the same location. The women weren't allowed to use the classrooms because the men were there, and they weren't allowed to use the restrooms in the building because the men were there. And it was a half mile to the nearest restroom. And
difficult to plan ahead.
It is difficult to plan that far in advance.
And
So they just put up with it.
And while they were on the job, they were also mistreated in many ways.
Sometimes they were.
Not always.
And it seemed to depend on the commander of a base, who was running the base. And the commanders who welcomed them as equals to the other pilots, it seemed that everyone on base did the same thing. Where the commanders were opposed to having them there, that filtered down as well, or it allowed whatever was bubbling underneath to come to the surface. And so at Long Beach, California, 80-some women were assigned there. It was a huge base, and they were treated as equals. They referred to their brother pilots. At Camp Davis, North Carolina, however, mechanics threatened to walk off the job and just quit rather than work with these women. And they ended up reporting every month to the doctor. They had to go see the doctor once a month. They assumed that women couldn't fly when they were menstruating. And so, of course, women just didn't say whether they were or weren't.
Right. Me? No, I didn't.
And they had no problem. There was not an issue there. But there they also ran into, they called one of the instructor pilots Captain Maytag because he washed so many of them out of the program. He was looking for ways to wash them out. And it was a hard enough program. About a third of the women washed out anyway, which was almost identical to the men's washout statistics. But at Camp Davis, suddenly an awful lot of them were washing out. Some of them it was sexual harassment. If you weren't willing to cooperate with the man, you got washed out. And some of them started complaining about that, but a lot of them, people were hesitant. And it's so timely right now.
It is. It's just
the women were hesitant to say anything. They were hesitant to buck the men, but they were also hesitant to report it because they were afraid that the entire program would be shut down, not just for them, but for everybody.
Now, this entire program lasted how long?
About 2 years.
So all of this happened, you know, as I read this and came to the end and realized that all of this happened just so
September
much happened in a 2-year period of
to
time.
December of 44.
So this came to an end, and as it had started, the ladies who began the program had a firm belief that this group would be granted military status with all of the privileges of having any military service member.
Right.
Did that happen?
It did not.
So it came to an end at what time?
And the waves and the spars and all were militarized by Congress. It takes an act of Congress.
With full military benefits.
Full military benefits, rank, pay, etc. The
Status
nurses as well. Status as veterans.
And these ladies were just very suddenly given a letter that said thanks, goodbye.
Yes.
With nothing.
Initially, they did not request militarization. The timing didn't seem right. They considered this program an experiment. As time went on, there were various reasons it didn't happen.
This is the part where I got more and more. I was angry at many points in this book, but then I got really angry.
Really angry. Finally, when they did apply to Congress to get the bill passed to militarize them.
And this was in what year?
44.
1944.
So 2 things had happened. One was that the war had changed. By that time, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was not much of a factor any longer. The Allies, primarily Britain and the US, had pretty well defeated the Luftwaffe. So they were not losing nearly as many planes or men, and they did not need them as much.
So it was easier to throw them aside.
The need for what these women were doing had diminished because the men coming into the military, they weren't desperate for pilots anymore. So that was one factor. What they did need that makes this factor bigger, what they needed was boots on the ground. They're preparing for D-Day. They're preparing for the invasions. They need infantry. Now, you have all these men coming into the military still. Some of them drafted, some volunteering as they get old enough. An awful lot of them didn't think they really wanted to be in the infantry.
So they didn't want to bother with these women asking for military status.
Well, that and the men turned against them, because a lot of these civilian pilots were now being drafted in as infantry.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want that.
Sure.
If they were going to be in the military, they wanted to be pilots.
Of course.
And so
everyone wants to be a pilot.
They wanted to get rid of the women so those jobs would be available to them. And they organized a very structured lobbying campaign against these women. They got the American Legion.
So therefore the women decided, well, let's just be quiet and not.
No, the women were told they had to be quiet. They had been given a gag order early on.
But no, I understand that.
Talk.
I understand being told. There's a difference between being told not to talk and deciding not to talk.
Well, they were following their orders from their leaders.
So they did.
So they didn't talk.
So years passed, and here are all these women who just
are disbanded. They
faded
go home,
into the woodwork.
They go on with their lives. About 30 years later, the other piece of it was that the records were sealed for 30 years after the war, which was not unusual. That was true of a lot of different pieces of the war, and they were considered experimental, and so the records were sealed. And they were told when they left, don't talk about it. So some of them, their children didn't know what they'd done.
And that's true of many things related to the war, where people come forward now and say, it's been a long time.
The code breakers.
Can I talk
so
about
on.
this?
Yes. Yeah. Can I talk about it now?
So in the 70s.
Well, by the 70s now, the 30 years has gone by in 1975. So the records are now available. Nobody thinks much about this until the military academies in that same year started accepting women. And the Air Force Academy, the Air Force is now a separate thing, the Air Force Academy announces, makes press release, that for the very first time, they are going to be training women to fly military planes. And at that point, these women said, that's it. It's over.
Good for them.
This is not the first time women are going to fly military planes.
So our time is short, so we need to fast forward here to the point where they are given at that point.
In 77, after a big campaign, they got military status for veterans benefits. So they're still not in the military, but they have veterans benefits, which they had never had.
Thing. But then things still weren't as all right as we hoped they would be.
They are not.
In
2015, when Elaine Harmon dies and wants to be buried at Arlington, and a few women had been, the person in charge at that point reads the law and says this is for veterans benefits, which applies to every military cemetery in the country except Arlington. Arlington is not run by the Department of Veterans Affairs, it's run by the Army. And so his interpretation was that the way this is worded, I don't have the authority to say yes. Her children and grandchildren, I think, were a lot like her.
Good for them.
And said, oh, no. And so they went after their own campaign, 175,000 signatures on petitions. They got 2 women in Congress who were both veterans on their side, as well as Senator Barbara Mikulski of Maryland. They lived in Silver Spring, Maryland. And in 2016, Congress passed and President Obama signed a law
that
allowing
all the WASPs,
them,
if they wished, could be buried
at Arlington, and Elaine Harmon is buried at Arlington.
Fascinating book. Fascinating book with that much of a happy ending, although way too many years
way too late.
I would recommend this book to anyone. Although this book is written for young adults, it's very much an adult book. It is, and I will say that from my aspect, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I was born right at the end of World War II. I'm too old to be a baby boomer, but in all of my studying of history, which was not very often, I know a whole lot about Christopher Columbus and Magellan, but I never, ever studied World War II. Oh. And this is a good book for those like me, I'm sure I'm not the only one, whose knowledge of World War II pretty much comes from television.
Right.
So it gives a good synopsis of World War II for those like me, and a fascinating read. It's an easy read, but not it's not a children's book.
Right.
It's a young
It's
adult's
not.
book. It's a very good book, and a copy of this will be in our Green Spring Library
Wonderful.
for all of you to enjoy. But I encourage you to read it. And Patty, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I've enjoyed it. I
It has
appreciate
just
being
been
here.
fascinating, and thank you for adding a good book for young adults to learn from. And I think it's especially good for young women, because in this time of Me Too and women not being treated as well as they could have, this is a good example for them to follow.
It is. It is.
Wonderful.